Hey everyone. So many of you have seen that Jordan Peterson was recently on Jubilee's Surrounded, and he was speaking about the subject of God and what that means. And he was surrounded by atheists, and there was just a lot to break down here and a lot to help with a deeper understanding of. And it just felt best to stream it because there's just so many things to stop on and elaborate on. And I also have these notes up over here so that you'll see me typing out the core wisdoms and elaborating on them as we go. And that will help us kind of ground and anchor the core cruxes rather than our minds just jumping back out to 10,000 conceptual things. How can we find and feel the one thing inside of ourselves that's actually giving rise to all of this discourse with itself about what it truly is? All right. So there's a lot of metaphysics in here. There's a lot of consciousness in here. There's a lot of ethics in here. There's a lot of understanding these conceptual labels, but really what they're pointing at is you deep down inside yourself. So let's go ahead and start it from the beginning. And this intro clip is just so good. And this intro clip alone has so much profound wisdom in it that is completely being missed by the culture. And we'll break it down. Check this out.
You're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
Don't be a smartass.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing. Right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
Okay. So even right there, there's so much. So, the question is, are you a Christian or are you not? Right? And you can replace, Christian with atheist or scientist or any label. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to pin down, right? There was this one comment. It was something like, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, right here. One Schrodinger's Christian versus 20 atheists. What's funny about that is that it tells you so much about where we're about to head in this conversation. Because you're trying to, pin down, right, like a superposition into something. And so that's really what this first intro clip is about. And so when there's the reply of, like, essentially the reply is, you can't pin me down. And then the reply to, you can't pin me down is, well, then you're nothing. And this is fascinating because when you're no thing, you're actually everything, and hence you are the totality of everything, which is a lot of what the Enlightenment or mystic traditions point to about what you are and how to find the nature of your own mind as literally everyone and everything. And so the reply here, and it's difficult to regulate your nervous system through breathing in situations like this, right? Because when you're sitting across a table, what you're trying to do is you're trying to see who's across the table from you as yourself, right? Rather than as a separate other being, right? And so if you can regulate your nervous system through your breath, you could reply something when you hear, well, then you're nothing. Then you could reply in a superposition of sorts and say that I'm both nothing and I'm Christ, right? Or I'm both nothing and Christ, right? Because that's really what the crux of what is trying to be communicated here, right? Because essentially nothing alone is orientationless, right? And so there's a certain amount of freedom that you get out of that deep realization of essentially it's, not subscribing to any program. So I think a lot of it boils down to this. That's why I titled this Peterson, Nothing, and Christ. And this is generally a pretty deep and difficult thing to understand for someone on their spiritual journey, or just even just a normal being in general, because you are obliterating all separation by saying that you're nothing. And you're accepting the orientationlessness, which another word for orientationless is freedom. So, and at the same time, that orientationless freedom is not subscribing to any program. So when someone says something like, I need to pin you down. Are you this label or are you not? Are you this label or are you not? Right? Which is basically saying, are you running this program or are you not running this program? But anyone who knows that they're no thing and everything, they know that they are a superposition. And so, therefore, this whole thing about being pinned down ends up exactly like what you just saw. Unless you have that ability, again, to regulate your nervous system, slow down with who you're speaking to, and make it very clear that the other side of this coin, which again is so difficult to understand, the simultaneity of this coin, right? So you're really looking at a simultaneity of a coin. Right. So, because what is, now if you combine nothing with Christ, right? So we start with Christ and we say, what is Christ? Okay. Well, Christ is transfiguring yourself into God. And then it's also taking on the holes sins for healing and awakening. Okay, so now what we're dealing with is okay, so there is an orientation at the same time. And that's what Jordan was trying to say throughout this conversation, which we'll get to. We'll keep playing this. But this first clip is really like one of the biggest, deepest cruxes of this whole thing. Because the entire metaphysics rests on understanding this fundamental thing, which is that, okay, I'm no thing, everyone, and I'm, rather than being orientationless, right, I also orient as this symbol of Christ, which is transfiguring myself into God through repentance, forgiveness, right? Self-inquiry, realization. Right, those karmic clearances. And then it's also taking on the whole's sins for healing and awakening afterward. Because when you, right, if you're running orientationless, then you don't care about self-inquiry, right? You don't care about your own karmic clearances. You don't care about repenting for your own transgressions, and you don't care about forgiving those who have transgressed you, right? So, and you don't care about taking on the whole's sins for healing and awakening, but not in a righteous way, right? This is where the key is, again, that you're very much at peace with yourself as the totality, and then those who want to repent, forgive, heal, awaken, they gravitate towards you and they ask you, hey, what tools can you help provide me for my own karmic clearances, for my own healing processes? And then you serve them, right? So, and that's more balanced, right? It's more balanced into everything is already free and perfect and my will as God's will. And at the same time, right, rather than going and being a martyr, running into making changes where there hasn't been the request of you, right? You haven't been requested to show up and serve. When you are summoned, right, those who come to you are summoning you through their own desire for healing. See? Right? And then there's no proselytizing. So this is really what it boils down to. The simultaneity of a coin, right? Where you're both oriented as nothing because you're absolutely free and you're everything. And at the same time, you're oriented as Christ. You're oriented in your own transfiguration into God, into the very nature of consciousness, right here, right now, talking to itself. The observer talking to itself, right? And if you keep going back through that observer, you get to the nature of God, which is all possible observers, all possible creation happening at the same time. And that being the root of what you are, and like a tree, and then this appearance being like the leaf, a leaf of that tree, right? Very simple, childlike symbols and analogies for trying to understand consciousness, the observer, right? And that's why in metaphysics and cosmology, when you tie the observer to the gravitational singularity, that's where you have a deeper synthesis of physics with spirituality, because then you're more clearly rooted as this tree, as this gravitational singularity that's hallucinating and lucidly dreaming all of these quantum experiences of information scapes and choices and probabilities. All right, so that breaks down really the first component of it, which is one of the biggest components, is this first one. So, and it's fascinating because if you really grok this first component, it'll deeply, deeply serve your own inner process and journey and clarity. And you won't get as triggered into all of the labels and trying to box yourself into one of these things. Rather, you'll be able to hold that simultaneity, right, of being two of the most metaphysically important realizations. All right, so let's keep playing the video.
Hello there, I'm Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'm a clinical psychologist, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, an author, a podcaster, public speaker, and today I'm surrounded by 25 atheists. My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peterson.
How are you doing?
So this claim here...
All right, so let's start with his claim, right? So his claim's up here now.
That atheists...
You can see it up here, right? Atheists don't understand what they're rejecting. So, and even more, it's atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting, right? So this is, again, it's so fascinating because there's so many components to it right off the bat, right? Because one of the things that you want to remember is that, well, okay, if this gravitational singularity of all possible observers is what I am, and therefore what God ultimately is, then from that place, it's not possible to not be God. It's not possible to not be infinite consciousness, right? So from that place, you know, it doesn't matter. You see, again, if an atheist says, I reject that God that you project, but that I see as the nature of the observer within, right? So actually, they're speaking about the same thing. If you make that clear, right? Because what you don't want to do is you want to separate the baby from the bathwater, right? So if you flush all of the bathwater down and you keep the baby, right? That's what it would be like if you were to say, you know, I don't agree with the dogmas in the religious traditions, but what I do agree with is the profound mystics across all of those religious traditions that speak about the nature of the source as consciousness generating this dreamlike experience. And that would get you to the same place as Christian mystics. Okay? So that's where you want to have conversations with people. You want to slow down, you want to warp and slow down your conversations from just ping-ponging and pinballing across concepts and across just emotionally charged, non-nervous system regulated disagreements, and you want to slow it down enough where you can more clearly understand what God is and how God is present right now, talking to itself across these illusory boundaries as the very observer, as the gravitational singularity itself right now. And that makes perfect sense from both the perspective of Christianity or from the perspective of atheism, as long as you know how to harmonize the two, right? Nothing and Christ. As long as you know how to harmonize the two. So again, everything's really fundamentally cruxed and predicated right there. You have to always start with that root and keep that root at the forefront of your heart and your mind and your mouth as you speak and your ears as you listen, to always be redirecting conversation to that fundamental crux or root. Otherwise, you'll get into all of these elaborations and proliferations and disagreements and all these kinds of things. And you have to have really good nervous system regulation and emotional regulation in order to be able to do this. It requires a lot of mastery. It's a very beautiful practice of mystics and dialectics that has been happening forever.
Don't know what they're rejecting. My background is in studying to become a traditional Catholic priest, daily mass, daily rosary, going on long retreats, deep into the magisterium and biblical hermeneutics. Like, I was thoroughly in it. And it seems like I do know what I'm missing. Is there something that I missed over years of study, both this issue formally and living out religion so deeply?
Well, you obviously feel that you missed something when you were practicing for the priesthood. Your aim was off then. So there's always the...
So the first guest here is a great example of someone who has actually trekked through a significant chunk of the direct experience of the Christian path. But again, how much of it has been the mystical, the deep, deep mystical, right? That's really a core thing of it. And here's Jordan's reply.
The possibility that it's still off now.
What was off about my aim in the first place?
I don't know. That might take a long time to figure out. But...
Then it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how they understand those aims to be. How is it that you can claim that people don't know something that you know about their life despite not having met them?
So these are both very good points right off the bat. So on one side, you have Jordan who says that consider the possibility that your aim may have been off, right? Or another way to phrase that is what I just said a moment ago, was consider the possibility that you are not diving fully into the mystical nature of your own consciousness, right? And the reply here is a fantastic reply also, which is that, well, what makes you the arbiter of aims and of knowing about the nature of the mind that you are speaking to? And this is a very deep question and thought, because essentially what you end up getting to after you go down this mystical path that synthesizes physics with spirituality, with contraction and expansion, with trauma or pain and catharsis and expansion and healing. Once you start synthesizing all of that and distilling it down into the fundamental crux of what self-knowledge is, you really start to see where all minds are coming from. And so there is, to some extent, a truth behind being very clear with how you reflect back to who you are speaking to about what program they are running, or about what aim they were aiming for, or what aim they are aiming for, and how that is generating their current lucid dream of experience, right? their quantum fields or information scape of experience is currently completely predicated on the programs that that observer is running, that they are lucidly dreaming. So when you get to this point of this deep, deep well of self-knowledge about what God and consciousness is, that then it becomes more easy to see where these reflections are coming from that approach you, right? They approach you and they want to have a dialectic. And you can very clearly tell where they're coming from, but you have to ask more questions to understand where they're coming from, to understand what kind of self-inquiry they've done, what kind of life path that they've been on, what pains or traumas that they've intaked from their youth, what processes have they went under for healing those, and how well they've synthesized science with spirituality. There's a lot of deep things to get into in order to be able to understand fully where they're coming from, and then to be able to give them these types of reflections. So it's that once you feel the well, you gain clarity to see where beings are coming from. So essentially it's what their aims are, but I like to say more so what programs they are running. So this also this enables you to clearly reflect healing and awakening advice when you are asked for it. Right? So that's how to understand this first part of the exchange, is that when you are sitting deep inside the well of yourself, then you are approached and you are asked about, hey, like, what was off about my aim, or what kind of deeper healing and transformational work can I do in order to deconstruct the illusion of separation, to understand what I am is at the most fundamental level. And when you're approached like that it's almost like you get to see the code itself that's being spoken out of the voice box, right? You get to see all of the programming, the scripts, the assumptions, right? And you get to help reflect ways for it to deconstruct itself, for it to heal, for it to transfigure itself, right? For it to come back home, like in the parable of prodigal son, to itself. All right.
Well, it's obviously a generic claim, just like the atheist claim that there's no God is a generic claim. In your case, it would have to be specified more, and I'm not claiming to understand what was going on in your mind, but my experience with atheists is twofold, is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they've often been hurt by someone who was religious, or by the religious enterprise, or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
But I think that you have a reductive view of what atheism is. You've defined religion so broadly to include any sort of having aim in life, any sort of cultural archetypes, or having a metaphorical substrate.
And that's an important point too, is that when you define, right, like when you define religion, right, as as literally like a program. And then you say that like consciousness runs programs, right? So therefore, essentially anything you set your mind to is a religion, a program. Do you see what I'm saying about that? So when you broaden out the definition that significantly and you say that, oh, even something as simple as drinking whatever you're choosing to drink right now in terms of the beverage of your choice is fundamentally a program. It's fundamentally a religion. It's something that you've set your consciousness towards, right? So you can see how broad definitions like that play out in conversations like this. But there's a deeper metaphysical wisdom in what Jordan is saying when he says that whatever you set your mind to is like a religion, right? So he'll get to this later when he talks about, what's at the fundament, right? What I like to say is at the bootloader, right? The well of consciousness is like a bootloader for whatever it's lucidly dreaming. So if the fundamental program that you're running at that well that's bootloading your experience of reality is Christ, for example, then everything that you do every moment will be oriented towards, okay, how do I more deeply heal myself? How do I more deeply repent for my transgressions? How do I more deeply forgive those who have transgressed me? How do I more deeply orient my life in service to the whole? Right? Like building regenerative communities for children of the future to have clean energy and abundance in food and water, right? Like it's these types of things that I think are being missed when you listen to this episode, because it is true that whether you look at it like a fundament this way, like a bootloader of what you're experiencing, so what fundamental program you're running, or whether you look at it as a hierarchy of what you're putting into the top program slot that you're orienting your entire life around, right? Because the question is, what happens when you put truth in these positions? What happens when you put, I will know what I am as my top priority above all else? Right? And just this very radical fire for self-knowledge about what one truly is, right? And therefore you automatically, if you do that, you'll automatically deconstruct the illusion of separation, right? You'll deconstruct the illusion even of local realism, objects existing independently from consciousness, right? And they'll give you a lot more flow. It'll give you a lot less solidity, right? And so this is a very good point, is that this very broad definition of religion, you got to like slow things down and explain like, why is it, right, that everything that consciousness is doing is oriented around a program. It's oriented around an aim, right? It has to aim itself in a way in order for there to be a dream that it experiences.
Atheism to you is a very specific type of like three people in the world that are these Raskolnikov type of, they want to get away with a perfect murder. It seems like you have the reductive view of what an atheist is.
Well, let's start with your...
And this is a very good point too, is that when you project out that an atheist has that type of view of like just wanting to get away with murder or whatever it is, that also, it misses the mark, right? Because that's not, to some extent, if one does not have an ethical alignment towards the whole, right? Love, unity, that type of thing, then inevitably they're going to believe in the illusion of separation, right? They're going to believe that they can get away with being super unethical and taking advantage of people and going as far as even murdering people. But that by no means has to do solely with the assumption of a label of being an atheist or something like that. It has to do more with the contraction of consciousness into its egoic identity. That's really what it fundamentally is. Right? So that's really what, if we broke down, like, why do these things happen? Why does war happen? Right? Right? A war happens, it's not because a war happens because of atheism, or a war happens because of two warring religions even. It's that, or over resources or land. It's the fundamental nature of why the war happens is due to the contraction of an infinite consciousness, which is non-local and omnilocal across all observers simultaneously. It gets contracted into believing itself to be this egoic identity. And therefore, from that place, then it starts to say, you know, oh, you believe something different than I do? Now I get to kill you, right? And that's really the root, right? The egoic identity is really the contraction of that, is really the root that then spurs the military industrial complexes and the religious wars and the resource wars and the belief in separation and all of these things. So again, it's about the precision of being able to get to explaining it at that level. That way you don't have these trip ups that happen along the way. And therefore, when you do go on your healing journey and expand that contracted egoic identity back into the identity of infinite consciousness, what happens is it very organically ends up orienting itself towards the whole, towards healing, towards awakening, towards love, towards unity, towards all of that, because it knows everyone as just a reflection of itself, right? But that's where the game is deconstructed, right? So when consciousness transfigures itself, right, expands, heals, it organically serves the whole. Love, unity. Okay. So, right, that's why, transfiguration is really the parable of the prodigal son, right? You never really leave. But you go on this wild, cyclic hero's journey, right, of contraction and then expansion, right? Contraction, seeking, and then expansion and healing back home, right? So you never really went anywhere. That's why when I say that consciousness is the gravitational singularity, what I'm saying is you can't ever leave that gravitational singularity. That gravitational singularity is the ultimate nature of infinite consciousness. Right? So you can't ever leave that. You can have all kinds of different dreams about whatever you want to dream, whatever kinds of experiences you want to contract and then expand, all of that. But you won't be able to leave home. And that's why it's so profound to just make the choice in life about, well, I want to deconstruct this egoic identity. I want to transfigure myself through Christ back home to infinite consciousness, to God, right? Okay.
Your claim how do you define the God that you're rejecting? Like, what is God to you? You studied in the church, you found that unsatisfactory. How would you characterize what you rejected?
I think the average Christian believer, when they say that they're Christian and they believe, they mean some sort of God that is all-powerful, all-perfect, is somehow involved in the matters of this world, and that we look to them through wisdom and with the Logos incarnate in Christ. And it also seems like you don't believe in religion in the way that the average Christian says that they believe in religion. And there are as many gods out there as there are believers.
This is, again, a great point, right? Because if we say, if we agree and we say, like, you seem to be a lot more of a synthesist, right, across many wisdom traditions, rather than a, quote, Christian, right? And why not? At that point, you can just take that type of phrasing and you can just say, yes, true, right? Because when you say that, yes, true, and again, nothing and Christ, right? Because we're using these as fundamental symbols of understanding what we're trying to point at, right? That's why I use a tree to describe what this is, right? I use a tree and a circle to describe what this is. Those are the fundamental symbols that I use. And you've heard me say that if you've been watching some of the content on the channel, because, and I've even spoken about this throughout the stream so far. I've spoken about how the tree is rooted as the gravitational singularity, right? The nature of that is no thing, right? The nature of consciousness, the nature of your mind is not the egoic identity. It is no thing. Therefore, it is everyone at the same time, because everyone's minds are that same no thing. So you are everyone at the same time, right? And at the same time, there's Christ. So what do we mean by Christ? Well, we use that as, again, a compactification. It's like a compression algorithm, right? Another way to, describe what Christ is it's really a compression algorithm for transformation and awakening, right? But again, if you see what I'm doing right now, I'm very much modernizing what has for the longest time refused to be modernized, right? If you modernize Christ into a compression algorithm, you're like, oh, I get it. It's like a compression algorithm for a way that I can deconstruct the egoic identity, transfigure myself to find God inside of myself and as all, and then be from that place, serve from that place, right? So heal myself and then serve from that healed place in a loving way that just shows up in love and then just awaits who wants to approach for their own healing, right? So I think we really need to modernize things like this in order for there to not be so much missing the mark in these types of conversations. And then, why the circle? Well, because, as I've been saying, you have this journey of, again, contraction, seeking, and expansion, right? So like trauma or pain into the egoic identity, then seeking through science, spirituality, all kinds of modalities, and then coming back home, expanding, healing, transfiguring yourself, finding God within, being the literal gravitational singularity as the observer itself right now. But you see, what we're doing is we're synthesizing religion or spirituality with physics, with cosmology, right? With metaphysics, with transformation, pain or contraction and expansion and healing, right? That's a lot of different things that you have to synthesize in order to be able to more deeply understand yourself and to feel whole deep, deep, deep inside yourself. And to really come to the end of your own seeking, the end of your own restlessness, right? The end of all of those things. And then for you to just feel whole. And then you're just sitting there and you're just like, I await whoever warps into this dream for me to serve, right? Because then you gravitate towards you from that place of peace, from that place of wholeness, from that deep, deep well inside you. You gravitate those that want to heal towards you.
Believers, because everybody has mutually exclusive and different views of what God is. So it seems
Well,
like
if everybody had mutually exclusive views of what God is, no one could speak to each other. The mere fact of communication presumes a commonality of assumption and definition. And it's certainly not the case that I regard any archetypal manifestation whatsoever as equally religious. So that's not a real claim. Let me give you an example. For example, there's a sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded with a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that...
Okay, so even just briefly on that point right there, if you hear what was just said, it was that
God is
different like this world, and that we look to them through wisdom and with somehow Christian, and they believe they
you rejected.
I think that all believe out there as there are believers, because everybody has mutually exclusive and different views of what God is. So it seems
Well,
like
if everybody had mutually exclusive views of what God is, no one could speak to each other.
even that point right there is so rich, right? It got a little hot, so I went and turned on the AC. That point right there, if you boil down, just as an example, right? If you say that the absolute is the gravitational singularity, right? And then if you say that God is the programs it runs, right? The quanta it simulates, right? It dreams, hallucinates, etc. Right? So if you go with this definition for a moment, it actually makes sense what is being said. Because, well, by both of them. Because from the perspective of gods, which has been said for so long that gods are at war with one another, right? But when you view it as programs that are at war with one another, right? I believe in my label and ideology. Well, I believe in my label and ideology. And then there's the war that happens, right? So if you believe in those like labels and ideologies as one way of describing the gods that are at war, then this whole thing makes sense, right? But then if you notch one more notch back and you say that, well, the absolute is this gravitational singularity, which is usually what people ascribe to as God, right? But if you notch back to that, then you say that, well, actually, this is the other side here where it requires you to run the same God or the same program in order for you to even have a conversation with yourself, right? So there's a billion people or whatever that are running the program called English, right? The English language is a program, just like Arabic's a program, Mandarin's a program, Spanish is a program, etc., right? That's one way to view it, just like your ideologies of political parties are programs, right? So in the case of English, what's happening is a billion people are running the same program, right, or more, which is then it's allowing those billion observers to talk to itself, right? So that's another way to view this and frame this, where actually what they're both saying makes sense, but you just need a deeper model inside yourself that gives rise to both of their perspectives and what they're talking about to then understand and be able to hold both at the same time and have something deeper that integrates and reconciles both of them. So that would be a big challenge through this whole thing that I suggest exploring inside yourself.
The mere fact of communication presumes a commonality of assumption and definition. And it's certainly not the case that I regard any archetypal manifestation whatsoever as equally religious. So that's not a real claim. Let me give you an example. For example, there's a sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded.
Before we get there, just want to come back here and write. Right, so that should put that into perspective again.
With a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that God is characterized in the Old Testament stories.
Yes.
Now, Moses is a faithful servant of God and a good man. At least that's the case within the confines of the story.
One possible interpretation.
It's the case within the confines of the story, obviously.
Well, not obviously. When we look at the Bible can't precisely say anything because there are so many different exegetical and hermeneutic views of this particular book, and that everybody has everybody has disagreed historically on, it seems like, even the most benign detail about a book this big. And it seems like you can only say that the Bible says something if you first presuppose that it's univocal.
So your claim essentially is that Moses in the Old Testament plays the role of a villain or is irrelevant? Because the alternative claim is that he's good.
I'm saying that we can't know, because we can't talk to those authors.
If you are going to start with the presupposition that there's nothing I can say about any of these stories that you're not going to disagree with from the perspective that there are multiple potential competing claims, then I can't speak with you. So
we also have a short time here, so I want to get to the core of what you're arguing here, and I'd love if we could
The core of what I'm arguing is that atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. So I'm trying to give you an example of what's being rejected and its complexity. Okay, so God rewards Moses with a glimpse of the divine. So this is a definition of the God that atheists are hypothetically rejecting.
A possible one.
I said I didn't say the.
Right. So you have God rewards Moses with glimpse of divine, right? So the idea is that if you very clearly orient your life towards running that fundamental program at the fundament of the foundation, which is self-knowledge, right? If you run the program self-knowledge, you get rewarded with expansion, healing, glimpses, realization. Right? So that's what we're saying it requires. It requires the observer, the gravitational singularity. It requires it to want to know itself. And then from that fire of wanting to know itself, it will deconstruct all of its own illusions of separation. It will heal. It will expand. It will come home to itself. It will orient itself in a way that is around love and unity, right? This type of thing, right? You'll be rewarded with glimpses and realization if you ignite that fire under yourself.
No. Said,
That
right.
is possible, yes.
Okay. So despite the fact that Moses is a stellar character and he's had a long and difficult life and can withstand a lot of difficulty and travail, God puts him between two cliffs so he can just see a crack of what's in front of him. And when God walks by, he allows him to see his back. Okay, so the implication of that story is that the divine is fundamentally unknowable. It's a pinnacle experience, and that people in their finitude have to be shielded from a comprehensive vision of the basis of reality. Well, that's not the God that's defined.
Right. So there's a couple things there. Right. So one is you start seeing, like, in the audience, you start seeing the others that are waiting for their turn to get a chance to speak about this question or another thing that Jordan's proposing. They're starting to put their flags up. So the timer's starting to build up. So the system itself, they're trying to do their best at creating some sort of system like that. But you saw some heads over there that kind of like have their head a little bit, down. It's like Jordan's going into explaining a biblical story, right? But in a way, a story is supposed to be like a compression algorithm in a way for a realization, right? That's what you ultimately want, like, a story to be, in a way, right? Like, you want a story to be a compression algorithm for a realization, right? But a lot of these stories, they get very elaborative. A lot of these stories are thousands of years old that have, there are codes in these ancient texts that are just very old, right? We literally live in the AI age, right? We live in the artificial intelligence age, and we're not yet finding the ways to modernize these things, to make them even more poignant, even more penetrative, right? To push the realization even more swiftly into who you're talking to about it. And that's what I would suggest is really, instead of going with the story itself, that is, there are certain ones like the parable of the prodigal son that are just absolutely timeless, and you can just compress it down into, the son venturing off and then the son coming back home, right? And there are ways to explain that just, I think, very clearly, transfigure very quickly. But then there are other ones that you just need to modernize. You need to slow down and add your own more penetrating oomph to them when you're communicating them. For example, like, you've seen how I've been speaking about, like, the gravitational singularity as the observer, right? You're not going to find that, right? The gravitational singularity as the observer, right? You're not going to find that in a religious book, right? This is newer, moderner languaging, right? You're not even going to hear, even modern mystics today don't even use this languaging yet, right? So that's where we're at with, we need to move our wisdoms, right? These multi-tradition wisdoms into a single modern, technologically literate, right, way of communicating, like slowing it down and communicating it very clearly with modern languaging, right? I've said compression algorithm or program, right? All of these things, they're not going to be in any mystic traditions. They're not going to be in these religious books. You have to find your own new languaging that is an upgrade that penetrates even more quickly in the modern era for these types of realizations of consciousness.
In that manner, right, it's not a simple personification. It's not a simple old man in the sky. It's something that in its essence is unknowable and overwhelming. And that isn't, in my experience, the God that's defined by atheists who are attempting to undermine.
Because that's what happens. You get all these red flags up, you get these heads that are like bobbed down, is just because in the modern era, you need the uniqueness. You need to be a synthesis across multiple disciplines into a single, more in a nutshell way of saying the story, of doing the penetrative insight. Because when you're fishing back thousands of years into a story and you're using that story, you're having these red flags go up, you're having the thing happen, right? So it's really the modernization and really the adding your own unique take. Like, again, you're not going to find, you scroll all the way up, you have this thing about both nothing and Christ, right? You're not going to find that in a mystic tradition or a religious book. You're not going to find the simultaneity of a coin, of two sides of a coin, right, as nothing and Christ. You're not going to find that. That's a very modern way of saying it, right? So again, you just think about how much more you can get the catalyst of transformation to land by just modernizing it in this way, right? And then you don't get the red flags and
the story. I mean, it's the same claim, for example, that you're a finite creature and that you face something that in the final analysis is unknowable, and that you have to establish a relationship with it regardless of your inability to perceive or even withstand perceiving the whole. Okay, is there a problem with that?
I mean, the problem is that when we look at, famously, when you've been asked, do you believe in God? The question becomes, what do we mean by God? And in the Bible, it's not even clear the biblical authors know what God is, because Yahweh has historically emerged from an early storm god, a deity that doesn't exhaust the category of deity, and that has changed over the Old Testament. Does God have physicality? Does God not have physicality? It seems like, yes, if you define religion to mean anybody that has an aim, anybody that looks at the unknown, anybody who wants to go from chaos to order is inherently religious, then yes. But also in the same way, I could define atheist as somebody who doesn't dogmatically believe in a religion, or somebody who doesn't regularly attend religious services or belong to a denomination. To help especially the audience kind of like boil this down, there was a lot of words there. That the central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
A central claim.
A central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
No,
Is that?
I said that we were finite and we had to establish a relationship with the infinite.
Yeah, then in that case, then we're all religious, but then I can do the same thing and define one particular element of atheism. It seems like we both have a reductive view of what the other side looks like, to the point where a conversation...
Right. So the body is a finite portal for the infinite to look through, right? And these are the types of simultaneities or superpositions or paradoxes that you need to reconcile on your way back home to yourself.
seems incoherent, and not just incoherent, but not in the way that the average Christian understands Christianity to be.
Do you have a
Okay,
problem
let's
with...
pause there. Sorry, you've been voted out by
Awesome.
the majority.
Hey, how's it going?
How
Nice to
you
meet
doing?
you.
Nice to meet you, too.
David.
David, good to see you.
Tell me everything that you know about the Polynesian deity Lono, L-O-N-O.
I don't know anything about the Polynesian deity Lono.
So you're rejecting something without knowledge of what you're rejecting.
I'm not rejecting it.
Do
No
you
more
be-
than I'm
do
rejecting
you believe in
anything that
Lono?
I don't know anything about.
Do you believe in Lono?
I
Do you
fail to
believe
see
that
the
he is a
relevance of
deity
that.
that exists in the world, exists in the universe, that exists in the existence of everything? Do you believe that Lono
I'll
is
answer
a
that
being?
question once you answer my question, which is, do I reject everything that I'm ignorant of? Because that's your presupposition that undergirds your argument, and unless you can prove that that's valid, then there's no point in...
My question is quite simple.
Yeah, but that doesn't
Do
mean
you
it's
believe-
formulated accurately.
Do you believe that Lono exists? Yes or no?
I'm not going to answer that question for the reasons I just described. You already insisted that if I reject something, that if I'm ignorant of something, I reject it. Do you think that everyone in the world has to know everything simultaneously for that to be valid and true?
I think in order for your
Answer that
argument
question.
to be true, in order for it to be true that we atheists don't understand what we're rejecting, then you need to also apply that to yourself and to Christians and to Muslims and to any other person on this earth, where if you don't understand what you're rejecting the belief in, then you can't reject the belief in it. That's the implication of your claim.
I didn't say that I rejected the belief in Lona. I
It's
said I didn't
Lono.
know who Lona was. I didn't say anything about.
So you see, sometimes things like this also happen where you're entering in with the what you're asking is going to be missing, right? You need to come back to what's at the root of the discussion. That's the best way to put it, right? Is what we are talking about here that the observer is a gravitational singularity, an entangled gravitational singularity is what the observer is, and that is what God is, and that God is also beyond that as all possibilities. Like, that's the root, right? If we start with that as the root and we don't leave that in our conversation, right? That's when you don't escape to those proliferations, because you get into these proliferations of these clouds, and then all of a sudden now you're talking about something else rather than talking about consciousness. Do you see what I'm saying? You want to always be looping the conversation back to consciousness over and over again, right? So that's a huge part of mastery, is really your ability to loop the conversation back to, right, self-knowledge as often as you can, right? It's like, keep the conversation rooted at self-knowledge, right? Don't let it get obscured into 10,000 things. Conceptual proliferations. Right?
That's because I've asked you several times and you haven't, but let me get to my even greater point.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying atheists don't understand what religion is or what God is in order to be able to reject it fully or completely. We have someone over here who studied it in their own way. I've studied religion. I have a degree in religious studies, specialty in Christianity and Mediterranean traditions. And further than that, beyond me, Pew Research studies suggest that atheists and agnostics actually know more about religion and about religious stories, the foundational principles, than believers.
That's because they're more religious than they think they are.
Okay.
That one's so funny. It just tickles, right? Yeah. So if you have like a quote labeled atheist that has studied many different religions or philosophies or spiritualities or whatever, right? Jordan's, and sometimes they are more knowledgeable about all of those world's traditions, let's say. Jordan's reflection on that is that, yes, that's because they are more religious than they think they are, which is true in some ways about religion being the pursuit of self-knowledge in some way, right? But really science, metaphysics, physics, philosophy, spirituality, healing, expansion, all of these things are to be brought into, right, what one is and how to awaken to what one is, right?
They're concerned with deep matters, and one of the defining characteristics of someone who's oriented in religious direction is that they're concerned with deep matters.
Okay.
In fact, it's virtually definitional.
Right, but they also have to identify with a religious tradition and accept the foundational stories that go along
Well,
with
that would mean more that they're sectarian than that they're religious. And most people, for example, in the United States, deny that they're religious but accept that they're spiritual.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Aha! Hi, nice to meet you.
How are you doing?
Good, how
What's
are you?
your name?
I'm Greg, nice to meet
Hi,
you.
Greg.
Okay, so I feel like you're getting at this idea of polysemy, where we have multiple related meanings for a word, right? Like, for example, a famous painting can be emotionally moving in that it changes my emotional state. And when I was on the highway coming here to the studio, I was physically moving, I was changing my position. If I said, I believe the Mona Lisa is very moving, and you said, you don't really understand what you're saying, it's nailed to the wall, I would say that you're the one who doesn't understand what I'm saying, not the other way around. And the way that relates to this is there are many concepts of God, and I'll admit, I find a lot of what you say about that interesting. I'm familiar with it. The idea of this kind of Jungian hierarchical thing, or as a metaphor or a symbol, or the kind of, atheist, materialist, literalist idea of
Right. So you already have there being some familiarity with what you just said was this, right, this Jungian hierarchical understanding of God, right? There are like that, right? What's running at the fundament, right? I can't wait till we get to that part.
agentic, omnipotent, omniscient being that intervenes in reality, right? So when I'm saying that I reject the concept of God, I'm aware of these other definitions of God, but I think that when we use words, we tend to only imply one meaning at a time. So the same way that I would say the Mona Lisa is moving emotionally, but I would not say it's moving physically. I would say I reject the concept of God in this very literal way. But
What literal way?
the way that God is this omniscient, omnipotent, agentic, supernatural being that sent his son down and has, caused miracles and all these things like that. The idea of God is
Do you
like,
think that there's an underlying unity of things?
could you explain that question?
Well, scientists, for example, believe that science unifies in a comprehensive theory. Do you, yes, no, or that
I know
there are
that people-
multiple competing?
Right. So this is a good way to also like bring the conversation back, right? Is there a fundamental unity of things? Like, again, this is how I would phrase it, is the gravitational singularity one entangled observer talking to itself right now, dreaming this experience? Right? And if you keep reframing and keep reframing and keep reframing and hold that root model and hold that root model and hold that root model, it will become inevitable that those that are repelled, that are in their contractions, will not be gravitated towards you, but those that are very intrigued and wanting to expand and to more deeply understand what is being said inside themselves, they will be here. They will be on this path of transforming themselves, of wanting to understand what is being said.
Competing truths. Those are the options. Either things unify or there are multiple competing truths.
I know that, for example, like in physics, people are looking for like a theory of everything.
And why do you think they're doing that?
It's interesting, it's helpful.
But they also believe that there's an underlying unity to things.
In a sense, yeah, like the material world and time and space are probably governed by universal laws and principles.
Partly that, yes, yes, but that the same thing might extend to a broader domain that would include imagination and value.
Could you help me connect that to the prompt?
Well, I'm trying to define God, the God
Yeah.
that I don't think atheists do a very good job of defining. Here's another question for you. What do you think guides you in your determination of whether or not what you're saying to me is true?
Can we go back? Can we stay on what we...
Oh man. Right. Like, so there's two things here. What guides you in your determination of what's true? And then there's also what was said a moment ago, which was that fundamental theory of everything unity also includes the mental, right? The observer, its programs, ethics, etc., right?
we were talking about?
We are.
Okay.
You're just uncomfortable with the question.
No, I feel like you're just kind of throwing different spaghetti at the wall.
I'm not.
Okay.
I asked
All
you a
right.
very specific question. What is it that you think guides you when you're talking to me to help you determine whether what you say is true?
Logic, memory, reasoning, sensory information.
How do you distinguish that from being governed by something that's false?
An interesting question.
How do you know the difference when you speak between what's true and what's false? So you could
I
imagine
infer, right? I can infer. I can.
from what principles?
So, and what are you?
Sure. Right. What principles?
Getting at?
I'm getting at the fact that your conscience guides you. Is that
Okay.
reasonable?
Conscious is defined by
Conscience.
my empathy and my reason are my foundational.
Define it any way you want.
Okay, so that's how I'm defining my conscience. Is my my conscience is my sense of
Right
and
wrong.
wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
does that come from?
I would say that comes from an evolved capacity to empathize and a recognition of the benefits of engaging with and nurturing that capacity. And then that empathy is constrained and guided by reason, right? Like, for example, I am driving down the highway, there's a kitten in the road. I'm going to empathetically feel, oh my God, I want to save the kitten, but then reasonably, like, I'm going to get hit by a car, right? So that's sort of the process through which I make ethical decisions.
Okay,
Is
how do
empathy
you-
constrained by reason?
Do you think that people can differ in their response to something empathically?
Yeah. Like,
Is there a mediating principle that can tell you one person who's empathic and another person who's empathic that disagree, who's correct?
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we'd have to, talk it out, right? We do that in real life all the time when we have, whether that's a discussion with a friend about the right thing to do in a situation, whether that's a policy discussion about law, right? That's where we can converse with each other, think about things, explain our perspectives, and then kind of reach a conclusion, right? That I think that we do that all the time.
So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I see this kind of goes back to what I'm saying initially.
I'm
where,
not defining it. Elijah
Okay,
defined
so
it.
as Elijah defines
It's
God.
defined that way in Jonah, too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also
got
defined
it.
it that way.
As I'm sure you know many people who've defined it that way, and it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm
okay.
just pointing out to you
Got
how
it.
God is defined in the Old
Okay.
Testament.
All right. So to respond to that, I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God, and that goes back to my kind of opening
Then how do we
statement.
specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, or we again, it goes back to my example of the Mona
I'm
Lisa.
defining God as conscience.
Okay, so that's interesting, but then you're kind of expanding the meaning of
No,
God.
I'm not. That's how it's defined in the Old Testament.
Okay,
in
so-
Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever, so
It's not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the
Okay.
major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets.
All
Right?
right.
He's